Hello, I'm Dr Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. Anxiety has a way of keeping us stuck, and that can actually look quite different for different people. And I wonder if you relate to any of these, whether or not it's decision making, putting things off, hours spent ruminating over something that went wrong, being self-critical, or turning to things like alcohol to temporarily reduce anxiety. This one's something that I've struggled with in the past, really wanting to get things right, feeling like there is always a right way to do something and that it's really important I find that right way and work hard to get there. I'm predicting that you can relate to some of these, if not all of these, at some time or another. But for some people, these kinds of challenges can really get in the way of living a rich and meaningful life, a full life. And it can really hold people back and cause a lot of stress and cause a lot of pain. Here today to help us to get unstuck is the wonderful Dr. Z. Originally from Bolivia, Patricia Zurita Ona moved to the United States 20 years ago and is joining us today from California. And I always want to say sunny California, but I'm sure it's not always sunny, but we might ask that question too. She runs a boutique therapy practice. She's an author multiple times over, and she really specializes in getting people unstuck from anxiety-based reactions and playing it safe when it's actually stopping people from doing what works, what matters, and what they care about. So welcome, Patricia. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Jodi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to chat with you today.
Oh, me too. Is it sunny in California most of the time, or is that just a myth?
I love the question. I will say that most of the times we have the best weather in the country, and it's almost always sunny, except some days with you wake up and it's super cloudy. But most of the times we have this gorgeous sun.
Oh, divine. Well, that's the picture I have in my head, and it's going to stay there.
Yeah.
Patricia, when you work with people, I know some of the things that you work with are perfectionism, high achieving behaviors. I'm like going tick, tick. Harsh criticisms is not something that I struggle with. And most of these things I've worked through, although there's remnants of them still for me. Rigid standards, difficulty making decisions, and procrastination are just some of those things. And this idea of getting it right. And I've worked with myself and have received help along the way about this idea of getting it right related to anxiety. I know, Patricia, that you've said before that getting it right isn't necessarily wrong. Can you start by talking us through what you mean when you say that?
Mm-hmm. That is a great starting point for our conversation, and thank you for the question. One of the things that a lot of the clients I have worked with dealing with perfectionistic behaviors have heard often is that it's wrong to engage in perfectionistic actions, that they should let go of their standards, that they have to drop their standards, that they should stop working as hard as they do. The challenging with those messages is that they can be alienating for people because there is some group of people, especially high achievers, who are prone to do things right and perfectly because they deeply care about the projects they are participating or their relationships. In some way, when a person engages in perfectionistic actions, they are very in touch with what matters to them. They are in touch with their values. It just happens that they are approaching every situation as in one way, and they are approaching as black and white. So it's like they're holding onto their values with white knuckles and not flexibly. So for people listening to us, I just want to really clarify that having the proneness to do things right and perfectly, or being born with a proneness to do things right and perfectly, is not a sign that something is broken or wrong with them. It's another area or part of themselves that can be nourished, cultivated, and even harnessed so they can do things that matter to them according to their standards without losing themselves, without hurting the relationships with the people they care about. So the frame is a little bit different.
Oh, I love that response. And as I'm listening to you, just the compassion that you have in the work that you do and the way that you speak, and this idea of standards. And as I reflect on my own high standards and what I've learned along the way is some acceptance for myself and this idea. And I read this quote that consider everything I produce, not me personally, but as a community. If we consider what we produce to be a draft that evolves, and so that it just helped me let go of this idea that when I focus with my values and I produce work that I care about, like books and other resources, that I can consider that I am going to do the very best I can with what I have at the time. But also this acceptance that there will always be room for change, and that's okay. And that things can evolve, and that there really isn't, at the end of the day, one right way to do something. It just depends where we're coming from and our approach. And so I've let that tight grip go. That white knuckle analogy that you shared is so true, I think, when it comes to some of these challenges, and this idea that we can nourish it and harness it and also be sort of a little bit kinder and easier on ourselves. I think it's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, you're tapping into what we call within acceptance and commitment therapy the processes behind perfectionistic behaviors, right? So, if I can unpack that a little bit, perfectionistic behaviors usually show up with a lot of over preparation. Let's say that I spend like 5 days preparing for this interview, right? Or if I have to throw a dinner, right? I go over all the different recipes I have to do. I buy extra materials, extra ingredients, and they also show up as under preparation. It's not ready. It's not ready yet. I'm missing this. I need to pay attention to details. Behind all those behaviors, we do have a couple of core psychological processes. One of them is the fear of making mistakes. That for some people is a special type of anxiety, right? They are petrified about the idea of making mistakes. Then you have this fear of being a failure. What if I don't make it? What if I'm not good enough? What if I am unworthy? What if I am defective? And then you have also these rules or ruling thoughts about how things supposed to be, how I supposed to behave in a particular situation. And you also have this fourth process that is this a strong attachment to personal identity defined by accomplishments, successes, and failures. Right? It's like the conceptualized self, as we call it in ACT, is defined by all the things that I do and failures and things that I accomplish. So the work and hopefully the micro skills that we teach people is in alignment with what you're saying, that noticing that instead of doing and doing, working harder and harder and holding with white knuckles onto these rules about how things supposed to be, one micro skill is asking yourself, what's my motivation here? Am I chasing an outcome, right? Or am I staying with a process? What am I trying to protect myself from? Am I trying to protect myself from failing, from not being good enough? Right? And when people start practicing these reflective questions, then you notice that a lot of perfectionistic actions are driven because we are rejecting to experience the discomfort that comes with the stories of not being good enough, the feelings that come with not being good enough, right? So we also teach people micro skills, and I teach my clients this, how to make room for all these not good enough stories and still choose to do what matters to them, not because they are avoiding the sense of failure or the story of being a failure, but because they want to get closer to be who they want to be. And that's where acceptance shows up, right?
Oh goodness. I that micro skill that you talked about, this idea of asking why, this question. And incidentally, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a conversation with a couple of women in business, and one of them said she had a sticky note on her desk. clearly visible that simply said why, to bring her back to what am I doing? What am I hoping to achieve? And I really appreciate that you've raised that, because with the pattern of high achievement and driven by fears of failure or not being good enough, there's no real satisfaction, is there? Because one achievement is ticked off and then the next one begins without the self-reflection and the enjoyment of the journey and the outcome and the meaning of the work that's been done and what's been accomplished. And so I really appreciate that you've been able to start to help us think about what's kind of behind it. And already you've introduced the idea of the micro skill of reflecting on why am I doing what I'm doing? And the second one that you introduced was helping us to think about, well, what is the motivation and what am I protecting myself from by the action that I am taking? And I wonder if you could help our listeners today, because it's so easy, isn't it, to get swept away in what we're doing and not have the room, the space, the ability to be able to stop and kind of take a step back to have a look at what's happening. How can our listeners today start to build that kind of practice into their day so that they're able to more regularly check in to use these micro skills that you're introducing to us?
That's such a great question, Jodi. Thank you so much. One of the things that I found in my work is that it's helpful to talk about choice points. Throughout our day, as we move from one activity to another one, there is choice points. And our choice points basically have two options. One, do I choose my values? Right? Do I choose to be who I want to be? Do I choose to do what truly matters to me in this moment? Or do I continue chasing a feeling of perfection that may not show up? Or do I continue doing all types of things to avoid feeling like a failure? So those, in order to catch these choice points that we all have these choice points throughout our day, it's important to go back a little bit and check our internal experience. For example, some of my clients, they describe this ongoing urge to do something, to go to the next. It feels like there is an itch that they have to scratch right away, right? And it's a familiar itch. It's cozy. They know when it shows up. So it would be important to check, is this one of these itches, right? Is this one of the things that is pushing me to do more and more, to work harder and harder, to jump into my next? So when people recognize those cues, in particular, again, is this urge to do more, it's important to ask yourself, what am I really, really chasing here? Right? Or you can also ask, what is this itch or this urge pushing me to do right now? Is it pushing me to act from the fear of making mistakes? Is it pushing me to act based on these rules about how things are supposed to be? Is it pushing me to do things relentlessly without checking what is important to me in the long run? So, recognizing these urges that show up and then practicing these reflective questions is half of the battle.
Yes.
Because that's how, right? That's how we break behavioral patterns, right? Noticing when they show up, acknowledging them, is that it's really like the first step to learn to harness the power of these perfectionistic actions.
Oh, it's like you say, it's half the battle, and urges pass, don't they? They are feelings, they are visitors.
Yeah.
They are like the weather, they do pass. And I wonder if you could share an example of particular urge that people might get that's common. And I mean, I can think of many. I mean, goodness, the urge to reach for something sweet, the urge to reach for a drink, the urge to ditch the exercise class that you'd booked into. Can you share an example or two of, or even just one example perhaps, whereby you could support somebody no matter what the urge is that they're having, what to notice, maybe what to do when they notice the urge, what might be helpful to help accept and tolerate the discomfort of wanting to scratch that itch, but knowing that scratching that itch is going to take you in the direction of a choice that is away from your values. Could you just maybe talk us through a little bit so that someone listening can go, right, I know the urge that is a challenge for me, and you could give them maybe a couple of ideas about what the experience will be like and how they can move through it without succumbing to it.
As you were presenting this question, I was nodding my head and smiling because, of course, I have many, many moments, right? I have a plethora of moments in which it's
Yes.
like, in fact, right, something a little bit ironic, but the last book that I was working on, which is an act book for perfectionistic actions and striving behaviors, the publishers told me, Patricia, you only have 50,000 words. That's it.
What?
No, not 50,000 one. No, it's 50,000 plain.
Yes.
It's like, oh boy, right? And you know how it goes. So I
Yes.
started writing, the table of contents, and I go chapter by chapter. And one of the things I have encountered in my clinical work is that a lot of my clients, they needed micro skill to become effective at decision making, to manage rumination, to grieving, saying yes to something they care about and saying no to also something they care about, to deal with fears about disappointing others, to deal with acceptance. So as I'm working on these micro skills, I realize, oh man, 50,000 words, not enough at all. And because I can be one of those people that it's a high achiever as well, of course
Yes.
I have like, oh my gosh, it's not ready, I need to negotiate more, I need to do more, I need to write more. But then that was a choice point for me in which my urge was certainly very strong to call the publisher and say, can I have like 5,000 more words? It's not ready. But then I asked myself the question, what really matters right now? What is really important right now? And I also noticed the feelings that were showing up in my body. In my case, there is a little bit of special energy. These urges, this itch comes with like a special energy, right? It's a very the experience of it is quite different. So practicing acceptance skills or acceptance and commitment skills will be saying things like, I know this energy in my stomach right now. I know this is familiar energy. So you know this and you name. Those are the first two steps. You know this, you name. And then you may want to ask yourself, what is this energy asking me to do right now? In my case, it was really to negotiate more, to try to get extra hours or extra number of words. And then the next question is the important one. If I act on this urge, if I call the publisher, will they take me closer to my values or farther away? And here is what is tricky with the perfectionist. That of course my mind said it will take you closer because then the book will be better, right? It gets
Yes.
tricky.
The irony of writing a
The
book
irony
on
is
perfectionism.
perfectionist, right? So it was tough, and that's why decision making is an important micro skill when you are a high achiever or an overthinker. And then I asked myself, if I do that, then other areas in my life, could be affected. Relationships, the trip that I was planning with my family, gatherings that I had to put on hold. And it was a time in which I had to sit with the sadness of saying, no, I will stick to 50,000 words because I want to say yes to these other family activities, gatherings with friends that are also important in my life. So that will be one example in which noticing the feeling, acknowledging the feeling, no need to replace it or dwelling, why I'm feeling this way, what's wrong with me, right? Or trying to suppress it with something positive, right? It's really about know this, name the feeling, and every feeling will always come with an action urge. And then asking yourself, what is this feeling pushing me to do? And then checking. With perfectionists, I think a lot of the work is learning to say yes to something we care about while saying no to something we care about. And that's where there's a lot of stuckness, right? But I think those micro skills are super important, super important. Otherwise, we are at the mercy of this proneness to do things right and perfectly. But learning to harness them is about distinguish when you do things right and perfectly because it's the right thing to do, and when you let it go because you also want to live other areas of your life.
It reminds me of this idea that it's behavior in context, and that to have a birthday cake and to indulge and have cake and seconds and a rich dinner and whatever it is that you want to do to celebrate on a special occasion is in the context of a celebration. But if you did that every single day outside of that context, then that would be away from your values. If you value your health and making good decisions for your nutrition and setting a good example for your children. And so it's this idea, isn't it, that there's no right or wrong here. Like you said, it's about what is the choice I'm making in line with my values in this situation. And that choice might be away from your values in a different situation. And just being able to take a little bit of time just to reflect and to notice and to tune in with ourselves, because we have so much information at hand, don't we, through the way our body responds with anxiety. And when we are faced with an urge, we feel it and it's uncomfortable. We don't like it. But often when we do indulge, in the urge, if it's say in the ringing of the publisher, or the eating of the food, or the saying yes to something we don't really feel like, we can end up suffering in other ways, can't we?
Yeah, I love what you brought up. It's really about understanding our actions in a given situation, in a given moment, and really giving ourselves permission to choose versus going automatically with the things that we usually do. And I think that, adding to what you're saying, I think that when we make these choices, we actually foster rich, healthy, and fulfilling lives, because the opposite is focusing in one area of our life and hurting our relationships, the relationship with ourselves, our spiritual life, the relationship with our bodies, right? So I think, again, it is important to acknowledge that our lives have multiple sources of joy and reinforcement, not just one. And right, and it's not about doing it perfectly right on all areas. It's about having a harmonious relationship with our values and all areas of our lives, not an obsessive relationship and we try to do things right and perfectly across all areas, because that's humanly impossible.
Yes, it is. It is. One of the things that I've heard you talk about multiple times this morning that I've seen in your previous work is this idea of acceptance. And I'd love for you to talk to us about radical acceptance.
It's one of my favorite topics. When dealing with anxiety, I think there is a lot of projecting the feeling, suppressing the feeling of anxiety, replacing the feeling of anxiety, criticizing ourselves because we're feeling anxious. In the case of perfectionists, what I have encountered a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to us, is this narrative, this story, this sense of not being good enough, this fear of failing. And what happens is that perfectionistic behaviors are trying to protect us from feeling like a failure, from protect us from not being good enough. So there are different experiential exercises to practice acceptance. But when I think about radical acceptance, I'm really inviting people to acknowledge their histories, and all those parts of themselves, including the one that is prone to do things right and perfectly, and making choices from that place, not from a place of self criticism, not from a place of trying to eliminate the story or trying to replace this uncomfortable story with a positive one. So that is why I think it is important to change the narrative a little bit. Perfectionistic behaviors are not necessarily wrong per se. It's when people learn to hold them lightly and flexibly, they can really find incredible golden nuggets and moments to be who they want to be. That also comes with really making room to say, yes, I have this proneness to do things right and perfectly. That's who I am in the world. And I just want to keep that on check as I move throughout my day-to-day life.
Yes, you have such a beautiful way of putting things into perspective for us and explaining just the way we are so human in the way that we operate, and we have so much in common, and it's not always something that we talk about. I think about my own history and my drive, and I once upon a time was perfectionistic, and I've spoken about that on the podcast before. And through my studies in acceptance and commitment therapy and working on myself, I've been able to adopt a very different point of view and a very different understanding. And I have told a story before of seeing those tendencies come out in our son when we were just drawing on paper. We were
Mm-hmm.
just drawing on some paper, and of course, little kids look at a parent's drawing, and my drawings are terrible. I'm talking stick figures and palm trees. I mean, it's not great, but in a little kid's eyes, it's amazing. And he would look at my drawing and he said, I'm a terrible artist. And whilst the old me would have wanted to show him the evidence against that thinking by saying, look at the gallery of all of your beautiful artwork on the wall, and try to dispute it, I simply said, oh, you're having the thought that you're a terrible artist. Is that a helpful thought? And he said, no. And I said, oh, well, let's just keep practicing. And back to it we went. I never heard him say that again. And I was so sort of chuffed that what I'd been through and what I'd learned about myself, and then what I'd learned through my training in behavioral therapy, was having an impact. And I imagine that there are other parents who are listening who are seeing this in their children. And in my work in schools, I speak to school leaders and they'll tell me that there is a lot of perfectionism among the students. And I wonder what you might suggest to a parent or a teacher listening as to how they might kind of start to help the young person that they care about to operate, or at least begin to think differently and eventually operate differently.
Let me just first respond to this beautiful moment you shared. What a nice moment in which that instead of trying to challenge the story or replace the story, you make room for it, right? I think that is part of, practicing acceptance and commitment skills. Another way, which you are very familiar with, that it's also related to the fusion, is naming those stories, right? Naming that here comes sassy, sassy Patricia, here comes judgy, judgy Patricia. When we're naming our stories, we're not getting rid of them, we're not replacing them, we're not challenging them. We're acknowledging that they are part of our day-to-day life. And of course, they're going to pop up, especially when doing what we care about, right? And yet, the story is a cue for us to check once again, how do I want to show up in this moment? Well, my story is telling me to do more and more, to hustle and hustle, right? It's another choice point for us. In the Bay Area, where I currently live, there is a lot of entrepreneurs, high achievers, doers, go-getters, and they are very invested, of course, in their children or their things going to particular schools, right? So there is a lot of academic endeavors and sometimes academic pressure to get the best grades possible you can get, to take extracurricular classes. And for parents who are listening to us, if they notice any perfectionistic behaviors, it is important to ask the teen, what happens if you don't do X? What happens if you don't get an A? What happens if you don't get accepted for this extracurricular activity? What happens if you don't get invited to this play? And really try to understand more what their mind tells them about who they are in the world. Because part of being human is making room for all those experiences, the ones, the sweet, the sours, the ones that we don't want to feel. The challenge is that if we don't learn to make room for them, then we start doing all types of things to manage these stories. And that's when perfectionistic behaviors start running a person's life instead of harnessing the power of them. So, really I think the key question again to summarize is, what happens if you don't do X? What does your mind tell you about who you are if you don't get this grade, if you don't do this? and really notice what the mind comes up, what a person responds when asking that question. So that would be one tip, right? And then the second one is really acknowledging that there are many ways to respond to these stories. And one way is to ask a person, really, if you do X, will that help you to be who you want to be in this moment? Will that take you closer or farther? It sounds like a cliche sometimes when we talk about these things, and we're not trying to simplify or minimize the struggle. But also within ACT, we know that learning to live a values based life comes with making these choices as they happen, right? And especially when these stories are showing up. So that is something, it sounds very simplistic perhaps, but I encourage people to try that and see how it goes for them.
Oh, thank you for sharing those really practical questions and this idea that we can ourselves, and we can also help the young people that we care about to notice what they're thinking. We can notice what we're thinking, and that's a mindful moment, isn't it? To be able to take a pause and to almost zoom out. Could you please share a practical strategy or another micro skill even that can help our listeners build on this ability to be able to pause and step away from being swept by what they're thinking, step away and be able to have a look at what they're thinking, just to give that extra bit of space and perspective?
Mhm, mhm. Um, there is a particular type of thinking pattern that you will hear a lot when people are prone to perfectionistic actions, high achieving, and striving behaviors. And it's this when, then, if, then. When I finish taking care of my kid, then I will rest. When I finish this, then I will feel okay about myself. When I get accepted at this college, then I know I am worth it. So there is a lot of if then, when then types of thoughts that show up that make it difficult for people to make values based choices. So when having this itch, it's possible that the mind tells them, when you get into this college, when you finish this paper, when you have this wonderful interview with Jodi, then people will see you, or your career will do this, right? The challenge with that is that we get consumed by outcomes we don't have control of. We don't have control of how people feel or think about us. We don't have control whether a particular project will be outstanding or not, right? So, one micro skill is to check, is my mind telling me if then, when then thoughts? And how do I really want to respond right now while my mind tells me all this, if then, when then? So that's a very important micro skill. And the second micro skill, if I can add here, will be when making choices, there is a difference between being a satisficer versus a maximizer. Overthinkers, they are trying to maximize and optimize every single decision. It feels like every decision is life or death, right? From the shoe that you're going to wear today to the person you're going to marry. There is this stress of decision making. Even it feels like a phobia, right? Like, but I need to make a choice. On the other hand, we have satisficers who make the good enough decision. So if a person is listening to us and you find yourself stuck making decisions, it's important to ask yourself, do I really need to optimize, maximize this decision? Or can I make a good enough decision? Do I give myself permission to make a good enough choice? At the end of the day in life, a lot of things can be satisfied, few things need to be maximized. So that would be another important micro skill to check, right, how we're making decisions.
Wow, the idea of a good enough decision is so powerful, and I I think that there are listeners right now who are hearing this, and I hope that their shoulders are dropping. This idea that it's okay to make a decision and for it to be good enough, and rarely comes a time where you can't make a different decision in the future if you need to. And
Mhm.
coming back to what you said earlier about perfectionism, and that there are times when that is necessary. A surgeon comes to mind. If you're a neurosurgeon, of course, precision, perfectionism, those kinds of tendencies. Perhaps that's why those types of people are drawn to those professions. But most of the time, a satisfactory, good enough decision is one that will help us move forward and get unstuck, which is where we started, because it is it is that paralysis, isn't it, of will I get it right? Will it be good enough? And this idea that, yeah, it will be good enough. It actually will be good enough most of the time. And when it's not, often there's opportunity for change and for a new decision to be made. And that's human. That's life. I wonder if you could share with us when it comes to a project, when it comes to something that we're working on, because a lot of what we've talked about sort of very much applies in the workplace as it does in our other aspects of our lives. When we are working on a project, what are some of the ways that we can think about our approach to getting things done so that we can make the most of the time that we've got when we've got the time and arrive at that sort of good enough outcome that we're looking for when we don't need something to be maximized?
Mhm. There is one writer, his name is Steve Pavlina, and he's the one that talks about two different ways of getting things done: bursting and plodding. So, bursting basically means working in short, temporary cycles of high focus work, while tuning out anything that is not related to that project. Sometimes, for some projects, we say, I am going to work on this ebook in the next 4 days, let's say from Wednesday until Sunday, right? It's a very compact period of time. Versus plodding means completing a task at a stable and workflow day after day. I will say for the next 3 months, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I am going to work 30 minutes every day on this ebook. The reason why this is important is because we think that there is only one way of getting things done, and it is important to make context based decisions. Sometimes in our lives, in our relationships, given where we are, yes, it might be better to work in a bursting mode. Other times may not be doable. So, learning to make this distinction is important to continue to learn to harness the power of perfectionistic actions.
Oh, thank you. Bursting and plodding. I encourage all of us to do that. And when we are bursting, there are some things that we can do to really reduce the distractions and put your phone onto do not disturb mode and block it out in your calendar and give yourself that time, because I think a lot of the anxiety can be overcome by diving in deep, the procrastination that can come from a big task. And sometimes that burst is going to sort of get you over the line a bit, isn't it? So that you can just set aside that time, put your head down, get a really good head start on something or even complete it. And that is a really beautiful way, I think, for us to finish this conversation. And I look forward to having more with you. You're so practical, and I love that. And I know that listeners to this podcast will so appreciate that. I'm always encouraging people to do something differently. There's so much knowledge, but making change is where we can really make the most of what it is that we are learning. And change can be hard. We can start small. You've shared so many micro skills with us today, and I'm ever so grateful to you for doing that. And again, as I said, I look forward to another conversation with you on the podcast. But for now, we'll have to bring it to a close. Dr. Z, could you please tell our listeners where they can find you online and a little bit more about what you've got available for listeners that can support them? I know you've got a fabulous quiz on your website. So tell us a bit more about you and where listeners can connect.
I do have a website, which is www.thisisdrz.com. And for people interested on the application of acceptance and commitment skills to anxiety struggles, they can subscribe to the newsletter Playing It Safe. on a weekly basis, I am trying to share some of these micro skills in a very actionable, compassionate way. And I also sometimes send promotions of different upcoming online classes that I'm creating. I have an upcoming class on Act Beyond Perfectionist that is going to be launching in 1 month. So for people interested, they can dive into it. And then in social media, I do Instagram. I think username is DRZ Passionate Behaviorist. I have to think twice to remember the name.
Yes, I love it. Oh, brilliant. And I'll put those details in the notes with the podcast for anybody. And I really want to thank you again for your wonderful work. It's been an absolute joy talking with you and learning from you. And yes, I really, really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your time and your beautiful, compassionate self with us here today.
Jodi, it has been a true honor to be on your show. I know you have been doing this amazing work for quite a while, and it's really, really neat what you're doing in terms of dissemination of actionable and compassionate skills. So thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you. It has been a treat.
It's been an absolute delight. And listeners, thank you for joining us. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. My cheeks are hurting from smiling because I've just enjoyed this so much. And I really encourage you to choose something small to apply to your own life and start small and be consistent and be compassionate with yourself as you try out different skills and strategies that you've heard in this conversation or in others, and find out what works for you. You may very much like to start with just noticing those urges, thinking about that choice point, in which direction will action on this urge take me. And I always invite you to connect with our beautiful guest, Dr. Z, and me on Instagram or wherever you feel comfortable to share what you're learning and what you're trying and what a difference it's making for you. So thank you again for your time with us. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the podcast. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.